On his 18th birthday, an orphan aged out of the system with nothing but a duffel bag and a brass key to a crumbling schoolhouse no one in the town would touch. The whole county had laughed at what his grandfather had left him. They stopped laughing the day he opened the basement door. If you've ever been the punchline of a town's joke, the child no one wanted, the kid the world had already written off, hit that subscribe button. This story is for you. The day I turned 18 was the day I legally ceased to exist. There was no cake, no party, a folding chair in the hallway of the group home, and a duffel bag at my feet with everything I owned in the world folded inside it. 3 pairs of jeans, 4 t-shirts, a worn paperback copy of To Kill a Mockingbird I'd read 7 times, a framed photograph of a woman in a yellow dress who was my mother, dead of a car wreck when I was 4. A small wooden truck a man named Thomas Vance had sent me on my 8th birthday with no return address and no note. That was the sum of it. 18 years condensed into a bag I could carry with one arm. Mrs. Gable came down the hall with her clipboard and her tired sympathy and a long manila envelope between her fingers. She had a face that looked like she had been telling boys their own bad news for 20 years and had stopped feeling it sometime around year 10. The hallway smelled of disinfectant and stale coffee, and the fluorescent light above us buzzed in a way I would later understand was the soundtrack of every institution in America. 2 things, Leo, she said. Her voice was as flat as the gray sky outside the window. The state gives you $250 and 3 months of medical. After that, you're on your own. And this, she held out the envelope, came for you last week, from a lawyer up in Pine Hollow. Apparently you have a grandfather, or had one. He died in November. He left you something. I stared at her. Thomas Vance, the wooden truck, the name on the package that had come once when I was 8. The only piece of mail I had ever received in 11 years of foster homes. What did he leave me? Says here it's an old schoolhouse. Property's been condemned for 15 years. The fee to transfer it is $5. I'd let it go if I were you. Take the bus money and go. She turned to walk away. Then she stopped, and for just a moment her clipboard sagged, and something almost human came into her face. Good luck, Leo, she said. Flat. Final. A goodbye spoken by someone who would forget my name before she reached her car. The rain outside the bus station was the color of dishwater, falling on hot asphalt in a thin, mean drizzle that smelled of disinfectant and bus exhaust. I had $250 and a duffel bag and a manila envelope, sealed and heavy in my hand. And I had no idea the envelope I was holding was about to change everything. The bus to Pine Hollow took 4 hours and cost me $31. The lawyer's office was on the 2nd floor over a feed store up a flight of stairs that creaked with every step. And the door at the top had a brass plate that read, Alistair Finch, attorney, in letters so old they had gone soft at the edges. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old paper and furniture polish. Behind a desk that took up half the room sat a man with thin white hair combed over a pink scalp, a neatly trimmed white beard, and spectacles he looked at me over the top of. He didn't offer condolences. He didn't ask me how I was. He gestured to a wooden chair and waited until I sat. "You're Thomas's grandson," he said. His voice was a dry rustle, like a page turned in an empty room. "He told me about you. He said you'd come." I had never known my grandfather. I had never met him. What I had of him was a wooden truck and a name on an envelope and a dead mother who had refused, the year before she died, to ever speak about the old man up in the hollow. Mr. Finch did not explain why. He only opened a file and began to read. The property was a 1-room schoolhouse on 2.5 acres at the edge of Pine Hollow Township. Built in 1888, closed in 1991, when the county consolidated the rural schools and bused the children into town. My grandfather had taught there for 41 years. He had bought the building from the county for $1 after they closed it, and he had lived in the small caretaker's apartment off the back for the next 30 years, alone, until he died in November. The roof leaked. 3 windows were broken. The chimney had collapsed in 2009. The county had condemned the structure 12 years ago. The outstanding tax fee was $5.40. "There is also," Mr. Finch said, sliding a second piece of paper across the desk, "an offer." I picked it up. The letterhead read, "Oak Ridge Development Corporation," in serious gold letters. $7,500, cash, sight unseen, closing within the week. They wanted the property to expand a residential subdivision on the adjacent parcel. $7,500. I held the paper in my hand and felt the world tilt under me. It was an apartment. It was a deposit on a real life. It was, for the first time in 18 years, a way out. I thought about Mrs. Gable's clipboard, the buzzing fluorescent light, the cot I had slept on in the group home with the springs that pressed into my back. I thought about how I had nothing, not a parent, not a sibling, not a friend who knew my name. I set the paper down. My hand was shaking. "I'm not selling," I said. "It's mine. I want to see it." Mr. Finch looked at me over his spectacles for a long, considering moment. Then he nodded, just once, and something moved in his eyes I could not read at the time. Years later, I would understand it had been relief. The bus to the schoolhouse left in an hour, he told me. There was a man named George at the hardware store who would remember my grandfather. There was a diner 2 doors down run by a woman named Martha who would feed me whether I had money or not. And then, as I was at the door, he said one more thing. "Your grandfather left something for you in the schoolhouse, Leo. He said you'd find it when you went into the basement. He said the foundation was the key." The road out of Pine Hollow climbed slowly out of the gray brick streets and into the rolling foothills. Strip malls thinned, trees thickened. Snow clung clean and bright to the shadows under the pines, and the air through the cracked window changed from exhaust to pine and damp earth. The town of Pine Hollow was 3 streets long and 1 stoplight wide, and the hardware store had a bell over the door that rang when I came in. Behind the counter was a man in a faded canvas apron with sawdust and pipe tobacco on him in equal measure. He looked up at me, and his eyes went still in the way old men's eyes do when they're trying to place a face. "You're Thomas's grandson," he said. It wasn't a question. "Lord have mercy. You look just like him at 20. He talked about you, son, every week, right up until the end." I could not speak for a moment. 11 years of foster homes, and the first person to recognize my face in a strange town was a stranger. "He talked about me?" "Talked about you," George said. "Wrote about you. Drove down to that home of yours 3 times a year, sat in the parking lot, watched the boys come out at recess. Said he wasn't allowed to see you. Said the social services people had told him to stay away. He said it tore him in half. He said when you turned 18, it'd be different, and he'd be ready." I could not look at George's face. I stared at the bell over the door instead. He loaded my arms with a tarp, a lantern, a flashlight, a spool of wire. He took my money without counting it and pressed it back into my palm. "You pay me when the schoolhouse has lights in the windows again," he said. "Not before. Now you better head up there. Folks have been laughing about that schoolhouse for 10 years. They'll be laughing about you by supper time. Don't let it get under your skin." I asked him what he meant. "They think it's a joke," he said. "The county wanted it torn down for a decade. Your grandfather wouldn't let them. Whole town's been calling that building Thomas's Folly since 1995. Now they're calling it the Orphan's Folly. Pay it no mind, son. They've laughed at better men." The walk from the hardware store to the schoolhouse was a mile of cracked asphalt that climbed gently out of town. The road bent past a feed store and a Baptist church and a row of houses with their porches sagging into the snow, and at the end of it, set back from the road in a field of dead winter grass, stood the building my grandfather had left me. It was worse than I had pictured. The bell tower over the front door leaned at an angle it had not been built at. 2 windows were boarded. The white paint had gone gray, and the gray had gone black, and the boards had warped where rain had got in under them. The front steps were rotten. The front door was a slab of weather-beaten oak with a brass keyhole and no handle, and someone, I would learn later, the local boys, had spray-painted a word across the front of it in red letters that had run down the door like blood. The word was dump. I stood at the bottom of the front steps for a long time. The wind came across the field and stung my face. A pickup truck slowed on the road behind me, and 2 men I had never seen leaned out the window, and one shouted something I will not repeat, and the other laughed, and the truck drove on. What I saw waiting for me there made me want to turn around and walk back down the hill. I'm glad I didn't. The brass key fit. There was a loud, protesting screech of metal on metal, then a solid, satisfying clunk, and the lock sprang open. I pushed the door, and it gave with a long groan, and a wave of musty, trapped air washed over me, thick with the smell of damp earth and rust and old paper and trapped time. Shafts of dusty sunlight cut through the gloom from the broken windows. The interior of the schoolhouse was a single long room with a high-pitched ceiling, rows of wooden desks still bolted to the wide plank floor in the postures the children of 1991 had left them. A blackboard at the far end still had a chalk equation on it, faded almost to nothing. A pot-bellied iron stove stood in the center of the room, cold and crusted with 30 years of dust. The walls were lined with bookshelves, swollen with damp. I walked the length of the room slowly. My footsteps echoed. The dust motes spun in the sunlight. At the back of the room, behind the teacher's desk, was a door I had not expected. Small, painted the same dull green as the wainscoting around it. A heavy brass latch and a hand-lettered sign tacked above it that read, in careful schoolteacher's printing, "Basement. Do not enter without permission." The latch was stiff. The hinges screamed. The door swung open onto a flight of stone steps that descended into a darkness so complete that for a moment I could not see the bottom of them. I clicked on the flashlight George had given me and started down. The basement of the schoolhouse was a single, low-ceilinged room, walled in fieldstone and lit, where my flashlight beam caught it, by glints of brass and glass and old wood. It was not what I had expected. It was not a furnace room. It was not a coal cellar. It was a workshop and a library and something else. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with shelves my grandfather had built himself, packed with books wrapped in oilcloth and sealed against the damp. There were filing cabinets at one end of the room, a long wooden workbench against one wall with hand tools hung in careful order above it, a wood-burning stove in the corner, a cot, a cast-iron oil lamp on a small table beside it. 2 framed photographs on the wall above the cot, and the lamplight, when I lit it, showed me what they were. One was a photograph of a woman in a yellow dress, the same woman, my mother. The other was of a small boy holding a wooden truck, taken from a distance through a chain-link fence in front of a building I recognized as the group home. The boy was me. The picture had been taken when I was 8. I sat down on the cot. The cot was made up, sheets, a blanket, a pillow, as if my grandfather had expected me to walk down those stairs at any moment, on any day, for 30 years. In the dead center of the workbench, weighted down with a brass paperweight in the shape of an apple, was a wooden box the size of a small footlocker. My name was burned into the lid in careful, deliberate letters. Leo. Not Leo Vance, just Leo. I knelt down on the cold stone floor and lifted the lid. The box was full of glass jars, mason jars, the kind people use for preserves, with their flat lids screwed down tight. There were no preserves inside them. Each jar was packed with rolled bills, tight as cigars, bound with rubber bands gone soft with age. I lifted the first jar with both hands because my hands were shaking, unscrewed the lid, and slid one of the rolls out onto the bench. I counted it in the lamplight, sitting cross-legged on the cold floor, my breath visible in the air. $1,000. One bundle, one jar. There were 41 jars in the box. One, I would understand later, for every year my grandfather had taught in that schoolhouse. My mind refused to process what I was seeing. I sat down hard on the cold stone, my legs suddenly weak, and a strange, choked sound came out of my throat that echoed off the field stone walls. It was a laugh. And then the laugh turned into something else, a deep, gut-wrenching sob I had been holding in for 18 years, since the night a state trooper had come to the door of an apartment to tell a 4-year-old boy his mother was not coming back, since every Christmas in every group home, since every form I had ever signed where the line for parent or guardian was a blank dash drawn by the woman at the desk. I cried until I could not cry any more. When I was empty and quiet, I looked back into the box, and I saw something else beneath the last jar, wrapped in a square of oilcloth. A letter and a leather-bound journal waiting for me. The letter was on heavy paper that had yellowed at the edges, and the handwriting was a careful, old-fashioned hand, looped and slow, the kind of hand you only see in men who learned to write before there were any other ways to do it. "Leo," it began, "if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and you have come up the hill at last. I have waited a long time to write this letter, and longer still to know you would find it. I want you to know first that I never stopped loving you, not for one day in 14 years. Your mother had your stubbornness and my temper, and you have her mouth and her hands. And the photograph I have of you holding the wooden truck I sent you sits on the wall above the cot where I sleep, and I have looked at it every night before I close my eyes since the year you turned 8. I want to tell you why I was not in your life. When your mother died, the state came for you, and your father's family, those people he had married into after he left her, petitioned for custody. The judge granted it to them. I petitioned next. The judge denied me because I was a 68-year-old widower living alone in a condemned building. I appealed. I lost. They placed you in foster care 6 months later when those people decided you were too much trouble. By then, a different judge had decided I was unfit. I never saw your file again. I drove down to that home 3 times a year, Leo. I sat in the parking lot. Once I got out of the truck, I walked up to the fence. You were 8. You looked through me. You did not know my face. I went home and I sat on this cot, and I did not eat for 2 days. I was not allowed to write to you. They had told me if I tried, they would move you, and I would lose track. So I sent you one thing, once, in your 8th year. A wooden truck I carved on this bench. I prayed it had reached you. The picture above my bed says it did. I have been preparing this place for you for 14 years. There is more than money in those jars, Leo. The schoolhouse sits on 2.5 acres, but the deed of trust that comes with it is much larger than that. In 1888, the township gave my grandfather, your great-great-grandfather who built this school, a covenant on 1,200 acres of forest above the hollow. The covenant grants the holder of the schoolhouse deed first refusal on any sale, lease, or development of that land in perpetuity. The county forgot about that covenant 100 years ago. Oak Ridge Development has not. Their subdivision sits on land they leased from the county in 2018 without filing the covenant notice they were required to file. That entire subdivision is built on a defect in title, Leo. The man who can prove it is the man who holds this deed, you. The original covenant document, signed by the territorial governor, is in the second filing cabinet, third drawer in a manila folder marked School Trust 1888. In the journal under this letter, you will find the name of a property attorney in the state capitol who has been waiting for you. I have prepaid his retainer. He is expecting your call. The foundation is the key, Leo. The basement is the foundation. Everything starts here. The deed, the covenant, the 41 years I taught the children of this hollow, the cot I have slept on every night waiting for you to walk down those stairs. You are the foundation now. Build on it. I love you. I am sorry I could not say it to your face. I am saying it now. Your grandfather, Thomas Vance. I read the letter 3 times. The third time, I read it out loud in the cold stone room because I wanted to hear his voice come back through the page. His final line was underlined twice. The foundation is the key. The next few weeks were a blur of hard physical labor. I patched the roof of the schoolhouse with George's tarp and a precarious climb up a borrowed ladder. I cleaned the iron stove and ran a new length of stovepipe up through the chimney. I hauled water in buckets from a well behind the building that still gave clean water after 30 years. I scrubbed the wide plank floors with lye soap until the wood came back the color it had been when children walked across it. The town watched me. The first week, no one spoke. 2 boys on bicycles threw a beer bottle at the front steps one evening and rode away laughing. A woman crossed the street to avoid me outside the post office. The men in the diner stopped talking when I walked in for coffee in the morning and started again the moment the door closed behind me. Then, slowly, the town began to turn. Martha at the diner started leaving a plate of biscuits out on Wednesday mornings, and when I tried to pay, she looked at me over her glasses and said, "Son, you look like you've been through a war and lost twice. Sit down and eat your biscuits." A retired electrician named Henry showed up one morning in a pickup truck with a coil of wire and a meter, and he wired the main room of the schoolhouse and refused to take $1. A woman in her 70s came up the walk one afternoon with a covered dish in her hands and told me, in a voice that shook a little, that she had been one of my grandfather's first-grade students in 1962, and that the man had taught her to read, and that she was sorry she had not come sooner. The property attorney in the Capitol called me back the day after I called him. He asked me if I had read the journal. I told him I had read it twice. He said very quietly, "Good, then we know what to do when they come for you." And they will come. They came in February. The second letter from Oak Ridge Development arrived in a thick cream envelope with the return address embossed in gold. The offer had moved, $30,000. The letter mentioned, in language that tried very hard not to sound like a threat, the county's interest in declaring abandoned structures a public nuisance. It mentioned demolition orders. It mentioned, almost gently, that $30,000 could change a life. I walked into Mr. Finch's office on a Tuesday morning in March, not knowing it would be the most important meeting of my life. The schoolhouse hadn't just given me a home. It had given me back a grandfather. It had given me back a name. It was giving me back, with every step I took up those creaking stairs, the boy I had never been allowed to become. 2 men in expensive suits sat at the long table. They smiled at me with the kind of smiles practiced in mirrors. They talked about partnership, about progress, about the community, as if they had ever set foot in Pine Hollow before that morning, as if they had ever bought a biscuit from Martha or paid George for a spool of wire. The offer they slid across the table was $400,000. I sat with the paper in my hand for a long time, and I let them watch me sit with it. $400,000, a number so large it did not feel real. I thought about the calluses on my hands from scrubbing the floors. I thought about a woman in her 70s who had brought me a covered dish because a man named Thomas had taught her to read in 1962. I thought about a photograph above a cot in the basement of a small boy holding a wooden truck through a chain-link fence. I thought about a grandfather who had not eaten for 2 days after his grandson had looked through him. I set the paper down. "No," I said. The man in the gray suit started to smile, the way men in gray suits smile when they think they have not yet been understood. I did not let him finish. I told him what I wanted instead. I would not sell the schoolhouse. Not for 400,000. Not for 4 million. But I knew, I told him, about the 1888 covenant on the 1,200 acres above the hollow, and so did my attorney, and the entire subdivision Oak Ridge had built on the adjacent parcel sat on a defect in title we could ask the court to set aside if we chose to. The man in the gray suit went very still. I would not, I told him, ask the court to set it aside. On 3 conditions. The first was that Oak Ridge would deed back to a new public trust, in perpetuity, a 400-acre conservation tract of the Covenant Forest, managed by the township and open to every child in the hollow. The second was that Oak Ridge would fund the restoration of the one-room schoolhouse as a community library and after-school center, with an annual maintenance endowment paid into a local trust. The third was that a scholarship in my grandfather's name would be established at the county school district, available to any child in the township, in perpetuity. The man in the gray suit looked at his colleague. The colleague looked at the floor. Mr. Finch did not look at any of them. He was looking at me over the top of his spectacles, and there was something in his face I had not seen since the day George, at the hardware store, had told me my grandfather had driven down 3 times a year to sit in the parking lot of a group home. The men in suits left without answering, but every person in that room knew they had already lost. The property attorney in the Capitol had filed the covenant notice that morning. The county clerk, who turned out to be Martha's cousin, had pulled the nuisance petition off her desk 3 weeks ago and quietly let it die. The contract was signed in May. They agreed to every condition. They had no choice. I stood in the main room of the schoolhouse with the first endowment check in my hand and flipped the switch on the wall, and the lights Henry had wired came on for the first time, warm and steady, and the iron stove ticked in the corner the way I imagined it had ticked when children sat at those desks in 1962 and learned to read from a man named Thomas Vance. It was not a building. It was a home. I stand on the front steps of the schoolhouse now sometimes, on cold mornings, with a cup of coffee in my hand and the smell of wood smoke moving through the field, and I watch the sun come up over the hollow. The bell in the tower has been rehung. The library is open 3 days a week. There are children in the room behind me arguing over a book about dinosaurs, and the woman who teaches them is one of my grandfather's first-grade students from 1962. Retired from the consolidated school, come back to where she started. I think about the bus station and the dishwater rain, about Mrs. Gable's clipboard, the buzzing fluorescent light, the words someone had spray-painted across the front door, about how sure that town had been they could laugh me back down the hill. They could not. They had only set me down at the bottom of a stairwell I did not yet know I had been walking my whole life. Abandonment can become protection. A locked door can become a key. A basement can become a foundation. My inheritance was not the jars or the covenant or the check that came in May. It was the chance to be known, finally, by a man who had been waiting 18 years to know me. If you have ever been the punchline of a joke, the orphan in the back of the classroom, the child the world had quietly decided to stop counting, I want you to know something. There is a door somewhere with your name on it. The foundation is already there. You only have to go and find it. Tell me in the comments below about the door in your own life you have been afraid to open. The basement, the letter, the phone call, the version of yourself you set down somewhere when you were young because someone told you it wasn't worth carrying anymore. I read every single one. Thank you for listening.